Hi everyone, this is Warren Herman, and in our previous video in this series, we began with an introduction for how to, you know, a an introduction to how we can Catholicize all cultures, and we spoke about how we can reorganize all the therapies according to a Catholic anthropology, how we can reorganize various and order and understand the landscape of different religions, different Christian factions. And one thing I actually left out of the previous video was an understanding of factions in the church. And we'll include that also in this video. But we're going to start from the bottom up. And we're going to just do a 1-second review or a quick review of how to redeem the therapies, and we're going to lead into then how to modify the religions. Then we're going to go into how to modify forms of Christianity, and then we're going to go into how to modify factions in the church. And so this is going to be a very broad overview of this. So this is obviously, there's a lot more that could be said. Again, this is an introductory primer to this subject. So, without further ado, the mindfulness therapies. What's good? What's bad? What has to happen here? Well, the mindfulness, the good is attention is a human faculty. The bad is we don't want to replace all the other human faculties with the practice of attention. The thing that really has to happen here is one of two things. One, we need something that's a more normal training of attention, such as the method of conscious sensations proposed by Father Irala, sorry. The method of conscious sensations is also derived from Dr. Vitaz, and the type of what they almost call a humanistic training in attention is much more amenable than a training in attention which in Buddhism is designed to see through the self. So we want a very practical and simple way of training attention is much more amenable to a Catholic synthesis, and also a way of gratefully acknowledging, a way of prayerfully enjoying the gifts that God gives us through creation is also possible in the redemption of the mindfulness techniques. However, there are dangers in the practice of formal meditation and the use of other faculties such as the insertion of prayers and thoughts and such other things is helpful rather than an overemphasis on the practice of attention. Although it is not intrinsically, I do not believe intrinsically wrong to be aware of various things, this must be done in a prayerful and faithful context, so that knowing who we are and knowing who God is, we don't lose touch with what is authentically Christian prayer, and this is in harmony with the guidelines given by the CDF about Christian prayer and the letter to the bishops on some aspects of Christian meditation, which is designed to discuss the redemption of Eastern forms. So we have to know, I'm not God. Even though I'm aware of everything, I am not that in which everything arises. That's just being aware of everything. Because your awareness is analogous to God. You are analogous to God. You're not God. You're a soul. And so this thing is, to have these understandings is important. So that's a very simple, just some comments on the redemption of the mindfulness therapies. And we don't obviously want to promote Buddhism through them. How do we redeem? Imagination. Well, imagination's okay. Just don't think it does anything weird. Don't think you can create your reality through imagination. Unless, there's some generic things like, okay, I can imagine I'm able to perform well on a test. I can imagine I can throw a basketball. Okay, there's some rational things, but if we think we're controlling reality through imagination, that's bad. But But otherwise, we could imagine things, in order to kind of prepare ourselves for things. So we could use those techniques. Cognitive therapies. Well, we can change our thinking. We can question our thinking. But this is, again, we don't use this to question our faith. We don't use this to say, we may use this to question dysfunctional aspects of our faith, but we don't call faith irrational like we do. This has been done in rational emotive behavior therapy. They say, okay, these are irrational thoughts. Morality is irrational. The problem is, these are bad thoughts that you think there's morality. But yeah, there's some ways we can use it. We don't want to fall off the wagon of saying there's no morality, but we also don't want to irrationally think that things should be different than the way they are. So there's ways in which we have to distinguish between actual shoulds and moral shoulds. There's ways in which we can realize that we should question dysfunctional thoughts and replace them with some that are better. And, this has been done by theorists like, I think it's the guy's name is Bacchus, has done, telling yourself the truth is kind of a Christianized version of CBT. And, there's some various things like that. But this can be done, but you have to have thoughts that are in harmony with Christian truth. So, for example, if we say as an ultimate solution to the thing of self-esteem is the REBT philosophy that I cannot be rated or evaluated on anything. If we just kind of take this flat thought, where the real thought is something like, I am a sinner infinitely loved by God, who has nevertheless has human dignity. It's like this is a much more complex thought. Rather than I cannot be evaluated on any, my worth cannot be calculated through any of my attributes, or there's nothing about me, I cannot be totally rated as an individual based on my attributes. This is kind of a flat thought that doesn't tell the whole story. So we can't stop there and say it's the whole story. So we need more advanced thoughts. There's some truth to the kind of flat thought, but it's not the biggest truth there is. So you need to kind of go beyond that. That's what I'm saying. It needs to happen to the cognitive therapies. Useful elements, but it needs modification again. Well, what happens with behavior therapies? Well, okay, there's some usefulness to okay, if little Johnny, if you don't punch your brother, you get a cake. Okay, there's some usefulness to that. Obviously, people are not pigeons. We don't want to look at them that way. So there could be some useful and some redeemable techniques, but as an overall paradigm, there's a lot of problems with behaviorism because you gotta throw that philosophy out, because it's like things like, I don't think people think. There's very strange philosophies with behaviorism. We don't want any of that. But there could be some practical techniques for discipline of children come from this, but they need to be put into wider context where these things are really just used as they're used as a supplement to relationship rather than a replacement for a relationship, because people are not pigeons and shouldn't be treated as such. People are not based on reward and punishment, really. So we need to get at this, and this is just kind of a remedial thing that maybe give us some different methods for training of children, or some type of behavior modification. 12 steps. 12 steps are very complex. 12 steps are, there's some really interesting figures like Sister Ignatia, Father Ralph Fow, there's Father Ed Dowling. There's a lot of really interesting characters already involved with the Catholic redemption of these things. There's also the, Catholic in Recovery. I think it's Scott Wieman, I think. There's interesting things already going on with a lot of this stuff. So there's a lot of different ways. There's also Christian redemptions of this, like Celebrate Recovery. The problem with these things is that, so essentially what, if we want to use recovery can't be a replacement for redemption. Recovery has to nest inside of redemption. There's a lot of complexity of the origin of the 12 steps, whether there's some occultic elements is on the table, because it seems like what's his name, Bill Wilson, the founder and the writer of the 12 steps, was open to some things that are semi-occultic, like so some odd things there. Obviously, you can't have a higher power that's not defined. You can kind of pray to God. You could have like a natural relationship with the true God, but you shouldn't be the kind of aiming around at weird stuff as your higher power. That doesn't work. That's not safe. It's also not functional to kind of have a moral inventory without objective morality. So that really doesn't work either. And then it gives you an illusion that, like, if you confess to your sponsor, it's giving you an illusion that it's giving you psychological benefits of confession, giving you an illusion that you are growing in morality when you don't have a real morality if you're not rooted in Catholic or biblical morality. And you also have problems with the higher power you're praying to. So you need to kind of like take this thing. It's like if you think about it like a toaster, you got to plug the toaster into the right outlet. You got to plug that moral code into the right thing. You can't replace talking to your sponsor with talking to your confessor. You can't replace these things. You might be able to use these things as supplemental processes in various ways, and maybe some other ways you shouldn't be using it. But the thing is that you have to be able to do these things in a way that makes sense, and in a way that you don't have this this replacement of redemption with recovery. So that's kind of some different commentary on the 12 steps and some things like that. And so the thing is, like, to see different redemptions of these things already into the Catholic tradition, we would say, like, for the mindfulness therapies, again, we'd have like Dr. Bottaro, pretty decent redemption of mindfulness. I mean, there's some elements that I disagree with, but these are very technical disagreements, and I'm not saying anything bad against Dr. Bottaro. He's a faithful Catholic. I may have just technical things that as like a clinical person, there might be some things that I might emphasize differently. But Dr. Bottaro is someone who talks about mindfulness-based therapies as a Catholic. But I think there needs to be more modification. I think you could kind of root his stuff in. You also want to look at perspectives like Catholic Guide to Mindfulness by, I think it's Connie Rossini. No, not Connie Rossini. Who's the lady? Can't remember the name. She's kind of against mindfulness. So you want to kind of take in some of these things to get a balanced perspective. There's some redeemable aspects. Also, you want to be taken in, and I'm going to link these people in other things like, so Brother David Steindl-Rast, again, his teachings are much more like, his teachings convey much more of a Buddhist flavor than I think is helpful. So I want there to be modification. I don't want you to, but his idea, gratefulness, the heart of prayer, is very helpful for the redemption of mindfulness, but it needs to be integrated more fully with a robust robust traditional Catholic spirituality. And also, I think that a very good Catholic redemption of the mindfulness techniques is Father Irala's method of conscious sensations. Also, you can get some good stuff from some things can be derived also from Brother what's his name? Brother Richard Hendrick has some stuff on mindfulness as well. Again, I think that there's some elements where, like, we have to realize that mindfulness is something new. It's a supplemental thing being added into the tradition. We have to preserve that. But we also have to preserve our own tradition and understand that, and I think that the way that we really get it into our tradition is through, I think, a principle from the Philokalia, which is prayer purifies watchfulness and watchfulness purifies prayer. And it's really to understand that, like, we need that Christian context for the practice of self-awareness, or else self-awareness spirals out, and then we have nirvana and weird experiences. And this is something that we would find actually in the actual descriptions of the CDF documents, a letter to the bishops with some aspects of Christian meditation, which is exactly what I'm attempting to say, something in line with that document, and redeeming these things. I'm redeeming what is authentically human in this. So that's what I would say with the mindfulness. Again, imagination is kind of not its own therapy, but the cognitive therapies, we could look at things like, as I mentioned, the things for the Christian stuff from like Bacchus. There's some things, the porch and the cross is useful. in this regard. It's a book that's kind of goes to, because we're going to go to the next thing is going to be religion, so we're going to mention Stoicism, but The Portrait of the Cross is about cognitive therapy and Stoicism. That's a very interesting book to read about the integration of those things. Then we have like things like I said with behavioral stuff. Behavioral stuff. I mean, I don't know if there's really a great book that I could think of that's or approach that's Catholic with that right now. But the 12 Steps again was Sister Ignatia, Father Ed Dowling, Father Ralph Fowle. These are people who are really involved in this, and there's some valuable stuff that they said. And we need to have some type of Scott Wieman, even the Christian approach to Celebrate Recovery can kind of be integrated to some degree, obviously with some reservations, just because there could be some Christian elements that are contrary to the Catholic faith in that stuff. But even especially the Scott Wieman and then those traditional older figures in the field, that's kind of the way to kind of bring those therapies in. So that's kind of giving us just a brief, very brief primer on the integration, some figures to turn to for some guidance for the integration of these things. So that's kind of a thing there. So I think that that is something that can be helpful to kind of think about it in that way. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on from that into an integration of the other religions, the other religions of the world. So we're going to talk specifically about Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and all those, Taoism. So we're going to begin there. All right, so we mentioned, Brother David Steindl-Rast is a very good figure to get some information from, but the ideas need to be modified because the teachings are suffused by a perspective that is more in harmony with the East. It has more of an Eastern flavor than a traditional Catholic flavor, and we need to change that so that it's healthy. So there's some usefulness there. Brother Richard Hendricks' works I like it better. I think it's safer. But here's the deal also. What we want to look at here is, again, Dr. Botaro's work can be used. I have some slight technical differences in different areas and things. I don't necessarily like mindfulness itself. I'm less pro mindfulness. I'm pro promoting things in a Catholic context. I'm not pro mindfulness in general. What else would I say here? Okay, so let's talk about Hinduism. So with Hinduism, we have a lot of interesting figures. We have Father Henri Lesseau. We have Father Bede Griffiths. These are folks that are useful to look at, but again, their public teachings, I believe, are more rooted in a Hinduism is something that when you kind of start experiencing the inner nature of awareness, it becomes hard. It almost becomes like if you look at a glass from the side, it's hard to tell if the transparency of the glass or the transparency of the water. It starts to have this kind of effect on the mind where a lot of people who engage with these deep states of Hindu awareness start to not be able to tell the difference between absorption in the consciousness and absorption in God. And so you get these kind of distortions in their teachings, and they start going into these Advaita or non-dual states of awareness, and that becomes very difficult to kind of get out of. And somebody like the teachings of Henri Lesseau, I believe, kind of reflect that. So we need better ways of redeeming these ideas than that in order to kind of bring that in. There's also we need better ways of so I think that there's some good stuff in the ideas of Father Bede Griffiths, but I think there's also some stuff that starts to really become too Hindu. So we need a different type of redemption of that. We also see in Hinduism the Yeshu Bhakti movement. We see figures like Father Anil Dev. We see a Madhuridam Ashram. We see the Yeshu Bhakti movement with its great devotion to like people, kind of spending time with the Blessed Sacrament, Hindu and devotees of Jesus who are devoted to the Blessed Sacrament. The one thing that's a problem, I believe, in this movement is objectively the fact that baptism has a cultural significance that's different in the Hindu culture, but baptism is essential to the Christian life. So I think there needs to be more of a sacramental emphasis on baptism somehow, and I think that's really important in the Yeshu Bhakti movement. And so, but I think that there's another interesting cultural enculturation of the gospel in the Yeshu Bhakti movement that can be really explored and even brought to the West. It's in different ways. I think that's a very interesting movement. Especially with its way in which it's taken in the tradition of bhajan. The Hindu worship. Of bhajans and the type of worship that they will. Kirtan. That's what I was looking for. So that type of type of worship, type of prayer, type of music. There's a lot of good things that can come from that, I think. But again, that was my thing about baptism, and also I believe more of an avoidance of yoga. I believe that what we need is a comprehensive alternative to yoga, which may involve breathing and stretching, but cannot involve the Hindu postures, and clearly discriminates between the natural euphoria of breathing and relaxation and union with God, according to the guidelines given in the letter to the bishops on some aspects of Christian meditation. Something like soul core. Soul core is a method of weightlifting that involves praying the rosary. So something like that. But I think that like something that teaches against yoga, that's an alternative to yoga, would be really good to develop. What else can I say about Hinduism? We also have, I believe, so there's also we could also have a very interesting commentary. I'm not a liturgy scholar, but there's, I think, some interesting arguments that could be given for or against what's called the Indian use version of the Mass. So it's like a rite of the Mass that uses elements of Hindu culture. If it's an approved liturgy of the church, I can't imagine that anything would be contrary to faith in it, because that's probably the operation of the Holy Spirit as far as I understand the way it works in everything in the church. But I think that there's an interesting, that's a very interesting subject in some ways. So, other interesting figures that we really need, but I think we really need, the teachings, I believe, of centering prayer are too rooted in the integral movement and in the Hindu non-dual conceptions. Similarly, you could find this with the teachings of Father John Main, OSB, also Father Lawrence Freeman. I believe that we can find something good in the teachings of of these folks. That is like a restoration of the tradition. Like if we can bring about something that's kind of more in line with the like something like the repetition of the Holy Name of Father Paul O'Sullivan, more in line with the ceaseless active love of Sister Consolata Petrone, more in line with the Jesus prayer tradition of the East. If we could kind of convert what we have in Father John Main's World Community for Christian Meditation or Contemplative Outreach as Centering Prayer, if we could make these things more orthodox, it can be done. Like it's like, I think the thing is we just really haven't, like we've kind of contemporized. We made things like from the cloud of unknowing too contemporary. We're not. I really feel that we just like we need just more guardrails on these things. Like so people, we have to understand that contemplative prayer has to happen within the sacramental life of the church, with like the cloud of unknowing proposes. It's like, so we have to have these guardrails to a greater degree, and we need better. We need to kind of remove we have to kind of not fall into the Hindu. Ensure that there's no Hindu syncretism. Ensure there's no that though we're like we're being reminded of the mantra, we're being reminded of our tradition of aspirations, and these kind of arrow prayers through the mantra traditions. We have to remember not to fall into the mantra traditions themselves. But although we can learn something, being reminded of it, this is an area we want to redeem this, and we should have similar organizations to Contemplative Outreach or World Community for Christian Meditation, but we want ones that are it's going to be more traditional, because that's more real for human anthropology, and doesn't go off the rails into kinds of because contemplative territories, we can again get confused, because if we contemplate enough, we can zone out without really zoning in. If we're not, we can get into errors if we're not rooted in the sacramental and moral life of the church firmly. We're going to have we have fire outside the fireplace, and that makes a house fire. We don't want that. That burns the whole thing down. So we don't want that. No. Because then the whole house is all dark, it's all burnt, it's all charred, it's all one color. Then it feels like, oh, it's all harmonized, it's all charred up, black, broken stuff. That's not the kind of non-duality we want. We want the non-duality where everything is bright and light, and the fireplace is making nice fire inside the fireplace, and everything is illuminated by the light of God, not everything is charred and black and all one. So that can happen. And the fire is outside the fireplace. We don't want that as we redeem things from the Hindu tradition. What else can we say about the Hindu tradition or these religions? I really think we could probably, just like we talked about yoga, we could probably find some type of redeeming way of doing Tai Chi, or some type of redeeming ways of doing martial arts. We probably do need to remove. There has to be some modifications of movement forms, because there's some philosophical components. So I believe in a redemption of, there could be a similar redemption of an alternative synthesis of martial arts, especially like things like, we could definitely probably need to modify things like Kung Fu. As you get further away from the source material, you probably need to modify things less. Like you probably need to modify karate less than you need to modify Kung Fu. You would probably need to modify Kung Fu less than you would need to modify Kalaripayattu. It's like, so it's like, it's probably, that's a Hindu martial art, basically. It's like there needs to be modification. I think martial arts can be done, but there needs to be modification. Like we need to modify it. We need to try to, I'm talking about this because that's kind of in the Taoism and that kind of department. You probably need to modify that. That this stuff needs to change. But I think that there can be redeemable things, and I think that martial arts are something that we should be able to get that. Because on all these things, again, yoga, martial arts, these things don't really make sense. This focus on the body doesn't really make sense even with it, because these traditions are all anti-body. So it makes more sense if it belongs in a Catholic tradition where the body is important. Body gets resurrected, ultimately. So that's that's some stuff there. So I think we should be modifying those things. We need to try to get a martial art that's purified of its kind of Eastern philosophical influences, and probably something like Sistema should probably be, with its kind of like Eastern Orthodox connections, could probably be a good blueprint for the integration, or something like we could kind of Sistemaize the martial arts. We could kind of make one martial art to rule them all, so to speak. We could kind of try to fit into, because you'll see things like in Sistema, like where you'll have kind of maybe like a use of a triangle, and you can see how like it kind of like in the movement. So it's kind of a reference to the Trinity. So just like we have this kind of Eastern philosophy communicated through martial arts, we should try to be able to figure out a way that we can kind of modify these things to communicate Western or Christian principles. So that's something there on the Taoist side. Just trying to think about things. It's also very interesting. There's some interesting books. Christ the Eternal Tao. So I think it's a book by an Orthodox monk. That I haven't read that one yet, but it looks very interesting about looking at how There's some other book about how Christ. There's some other book, I forgot what it's called, but it's about how Christ fulfills Chinese culture. So there are some useful books on these subjects that I think could be helpful. Especially this is so we talked a little bit about Hinduism, Taoism. I mentioned with the Buddhism, before, Brother David Steindl-Rast and his dialogues with Thich Nhat Hanh. So Thich Nhat Hanh is a very good person to read. Like his book Living Buddha, Living Christ is good to read, just to kind of understand the Buddhist perspective. His Order of Interbeing and Thich Nhat Hanh's books are already a modified form of Buddhism that is progressing in a sense toward Christianity because of his understanding of he's a modified understanding of interbeing, which is warmer because it's like he's like, okay, Buddhists are usually like everything is related to everything else, but it's usually not as warm as like, oh, isn't that nice that I'm being sustained by the clouds? Like it's not like a nice thing. It's just like everything just is originating everything, and everything's just nothing, and everything kind of depends on everything else rather than being created. But there's a kind of nice interaction that he emphasizes, this interbeing. But it needs to be brought into, I think, a very beautiful synthesis that we should see there is the element of divine love that is brought in by the teachings of Brother Richard Hendrick, where he talks about, like, he kind of is talking about mindfulness, but that there's this element not only of this interbeing, but there's this context which actually makes there be enough warmth. Because the thing is, yeah, like, so there's not enough. It doesn't make sense. There's no cloud, but the cloud is helping me. Like there needs to be a cloud. Like it's like there needs to be there needs to be the God that speaks the cloud into existence, that's allowing the cloud to be there. So that there's like some grounding to the whole process of this warm interaction of all the factors in reality. So it's really this Brother David Hendrick plus Thich Nhat Hanh is a really good pathway into Buddhism. Also, modifications of metta bhavana, which is a loving kindness meditation, and also the four Brahma Viharas are probably pretty well redeemable into prayer practices. The Brahma Viharas are things like they're mental cultivations to have like equanimity, goodwill, and stuff like that. They're very prayer-y practice. They're really like wishing people goodwill rather than praying, but they could just probably be made into prayers. So there's a lot of things like that can be modified. And things that we say about like the techniques of Thich Nhat Hanh, Vipassana meditation can be similarly modified, like along the lines of mindfulness, to be a practice of gratitude, that we're being aware of we have a better knowledge of ourselves in a Christian context, a more appreciative mindset rather than just an analytical mindset. So those are some things that could be modified in Buddhism. And similarly, some of the practices like Tonglen, which is like I think called giving and taking, which you could probably have some modifications, like, okay, like I bring this pain to Christ and I ask Christ to give His grace to you, and you could probably modify. These are Tibetan practices. I would say probably don't try Dzogchen, which is like squinting your brain in a weird way. Probably don't try that, but it's probably a way of redeeming it. I did think about this once. There are ways of redeeming it, but it's pretty powerful. So I don't know if you should mess with it. These are just some random ideas about redemption of these things. And also a lot. I think you also. I mean, this is something that is way above my pay grade to figure out. But I really think that like a lot of like the Tibetan, a lot of like the different schools of Buddhism, you can kind of make a liturgical style, an iconographic style that's similar to the Thangkas, can be made into the Thangka icons of Tibet can be made into an iconographic style of actual icons. And like, a lot of their liturgical implements can be, like the things that look like their liturgical implements can be flipped around to be made into like actual liturgical implements. And you probably could create like a Tibetan rite. They have miters almost on their lamas. You could probably like mess some things around and actually make like if it was culturally good and it was, decided by the church, this probably could be done. I'm not saying that we should do it prudently. I'm not trying to do this as a weird experiment. I'm trying to do this like, how could we do this in a really reverent and great way? That's what I'm thinking about here. So there could be like a Buddhist. So and even if you brought it all together, you probably can figure out a way that to bring all the different Buddhist sects together, because Catholicism could kind of like we could kind of make a spectrum of Buddhist types, and we could kind of bring them all together under a Catholic umbrella. So those are some different things that I just some brief thoughts on the evangelization of Buddhism, the evangelization of Hinduism, the evangelization of Taoism. I'll throw in a little bit about Sikhism here. Sikhism is very interesting. We could say similar things about Sikh forms of meditation. Obviously, repeating the name of Jesus rather than the different forms that are rather than the mantras that are used. They have kinds of ceremonies of baptism. They have the Khalsa, which is like almost like a monastic order. I think there are probably really interesting ways that you could have like kind of like some married kind of monastics from the Sikh tradition. Like we could kind of find some type of lay consecrated semi-married. We could kind of make these like these new categories of folks. Bringing these things into the church in a way. The Khalsa could be a monastic order. The Khalsa is like a group of like really practicing Sikhs. So, they have like they really don't cut their hair. They have they wear the kirpan, which is a dagger in their outfit. Don't worry, they're not just like stabbing people. They're nice people. There's a lot of stuff that could probably be redeemed from Sikhism. I don't even really see any problem with the idea of just letting your hair grow as a sign of your trust in God's prophet. I mean, it's not like intrinsically wrong. So it's like there's all different things that you probably can redeem out of these groups, and obviously some of the meditative things would be redeemed in similar ways to the meditative things I've already discussed. So those are some different things that I'd say. Just some different ideas, and really the thing is, letter to the bishops on some aspects of Christian meditation. Probably a good place to look at. Kind of distinguishing between like the natural euphoria of like any psychophysical techniques and grace is really important. That's a big principle in the redemption of these things because there is a lot of psychophysical stuff going on here, and so that's kind of what we want to do. But really, what we get out of this level is a robust training and awareness. And so that's what we bring out of this level of the chart. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this here because we're at 30 minutes again, and then I'm going to make another video that's going to discuss because the next week is from what we just talked about this. Then we have to go to imagination is not really a religion. So we're going to talk about, we'll probably talk about Stoicism. And we could talk about Confucianism. Then we could talk about Judaism and Islam. So that's where we would go. That's where we're going from here. But I want to pause this here because, that's enough length for one video. And we want to make sure that we can there's not too much stuff in one of these. So that's where we need to go in these next things, and then we'll go through the factions of the church and so on and so forth.